Now, this next section of the presentation is a little bit on the dry side, but the material is really important. So pay attention regardless of how you feel about it. Now, let's see. There we go. All right. I'm going to talk about Emmerich de Vattel, who was a Prussian lawyer in the 18th century. He was interested primarily in shaping international law, and he was arguably the single most important figure in creating international law as we know it today. In other words, his work has influenced everything from General Order 100, which were issued by the Union Army during the American Civil War, with the first official set of instructions for how armies were to conduct themselves in the field, the American Army. And the Hague Convention, which you probably haven't heard of, and the Geneva Conventions, which you probably definitely have heard of. Vattel is behind all of that. And his most influential book is called The Law of Nations, and it was first published in 1758. And it covers like everything you could possibly think of concerning international relations, and some that you can't. About a third of it deals with war and warfare. And of course, obviously, that's the part of the book that we're going to drill down on. Now, the major principles of Vattel's thought are these. First, it is fundamentally important to respect the sovereignty of other nations. Nations should treat one another with justice and not pressure or make war upon another nation without good reason. Treaties, when they're made, must be observed and respected and dissolved only under certain conditions. Sovereigns alone have the right to declare war. You have to be the monarch. You have to be the head of a country to be able to declare war. Lesser lords and princes don't have the power to declare war. Or certainly, no private citizen or whatever has the power to declare war. Just the sovereign. And wars are justified if necessary for defense or to protect what he calls the essential interests of the state. But he didn't quite get as far as saying that sovereigns could choose war only as a last resort. That element of international law was yet to come. He regarded, like the monarchs of Europe during this period, war as a sort of a normal function of the state. And so he set sort of conditions on when you could resort to war, but he assumed that warfare was going to occur and that it was legitimate and so on. War should be confined to purely military operations as much as possible. However, subjects of an enemy state were enemies themselves. So there's that, but they should not be harmed as long as they did not aid the enemy and obeyed the occupying force. Now, this is a big exception. Civilian property could be seized or destroyed. This is a direct quote from the book. We have a right to deprive our enemy of his possessions, of everything which may augment his strength and enable him to make war. But attacks on property had to be restricted by military necessity. It could not be due to hatred or fury. And he writes, those who tear up the vines and cut down the fruit trees are looked upon as savage barbarians. They desolate a country for many years to come and beyond what their own safety requires. And of course, any of this kind of destruction, whether it's necessary or this kind of unnecessary destruction, is really hard on civilians. It's not that they only mind not getting killed or having their families get killed. They mind having their property destroyed, their crops, their livestock, sometimes the houses that they live in. And so this age of so-called limited war, even by the rules that Vattel sets, Not so limited. If you are a civilian in the path of an invading army. Now, ordinarily, an enemy may not be killed once he ceases to resist. And if an enemy seeks to surrender, his surrender, if he's an individual, or its surrender, if it's a military unit or a country or whatever, has to be accepted. Now, this is an interesting feature of 18th century warfare. If a besieged city resists only up to the point where a breach has been made in its fortifications, in its walls, then its defenders and population are to be allowed to surrender. But if the defenders continue to resist past that point, then kind of all bets are off. The city can be pillaged and its defenders may be offered no quarter, which means to say that they can be killed regardless of whether they offer to surrender or not. And this was really to limit the casualties that the besieging army would sustain if it had, after this whole siege, had to actually go into actual battle in order to seize the city. This was a strong deterrent to forcing an army to do that. In effect, turning a siege into the equivalent of a major battle, which European armies, as I've said, have tried to avoid during this period. Let me talk a little bit more about civilians during this age of limited war. This age of limited war was an age of misery for many European civilians. And to repeat, although Vattel argued that civilians should be spared violence in their persons, this was not always done. And Vattel argued, as we've seen, that civilian property could be taken whenever and to whatever degree that military necessity required. And the seizure of this property was usually accompanied by unauthorized but widespread looting, as shown in this illustration. These are French soldiers in basically a German-speaking town, looting and ravaging and so on. So it remained the case that when armies needed to forage locally for crops and livestock, or to destroy crops and livestock to deny them to the enemy, civilians suffered significantly. It also remained the case that civilians living within cities under siege also had to deal with the terrors of war. And sieges were numerous, since military commanders often preferred not to risk their armies in pitched battles. And there was one incident that profoundly shocked all of Europe: the devastation of the Palatinate in 1688-89. So this gets a little bit before the 18th century, but it's part and parcel of this so-called age of limited war. Here's what happened. The Palatinate was a small principality within the Holy Roman Empire, controlled by the House of Habsburg, and it was located near the border with France. At the outbreak of a war between the House of Habsburg and the French House of Bourbon in 1688, Louis XIV and his senior commanders decided to advance into the Palatinate, first of all, and try to control it. But once that became impossible, what they decided to do was to destroy 20 key cities in the Palatinate, as well as many towns and villages, in order to create, in effect, a kind of a fire break that would force a halt to the advancing Austrian forces, by which I mean the forces of the House of Habsburg. And this destruction was planned and carried out with great deliberation. Louis XIV and his Minister of War pored over maps to figure out exactly what they wanted to destroy. The king and his minister also instructed soldiers to carry out the actual work in a disciplined manner, without pillaging. but it proved almost impossible to command a soldier to burn down a house, let's say, but not to steal any of its contents or abuse its occupants. And some of the work of destruction was done by relatively small patrols that operated out of the sight of army commanders, so they could, they could loot and pillage without getting caught or even, seen doing it. And whenever wine was discovered in the cellar of a doomed building, you can imagine what happened. The soldiers naturally helped themselves and got drunk, and in their disinhibited state, committed some awful excesses. So these two maps give you an idea of the scale of the devastation of the Palatinate. If you follow the blue ribbon of the Rhine River, it basically runs through the center of the map on the left. You know, if you work your way sort of from from north to south, you'll eventually see two cities called Mannheim and Philipsburg. They were at ground zero of the devastation, where the level of destruction was almost total. And if you look at the map on the right, it shows the extent of the devastation, and the shaded areas depict the approximate levels of damage in each region that they represent. The large black lozenge, if you will, in the center of the map, that shows the location of Mannheim and Philipsburg. And it's black. The fact that it's just jet black shows that in this area, destruction was total. The dark shaded areas show where destruction was extensive, but still only partial. And the light shaded area shows where destruction occurred, but was scattered. But look at the extent of the overall area of this destruction of the Palatinate, which is in a way misnamed because some of what got destroyed was outside of the Palatinate. But anyway, regardless, Europe had not seen anything like the devastation of the Palatinate, since the awful years of the 30 Years' War. And onlookers across the continent of Europe were horrified. But there was a key difference between the destruction that you saw during the 30 Years' War and that of the devastation of the Palatinate. The former was the product of rage, religious fanaticism, and marauding soldiers, mercenaries, and so on. The latter, the devastation of the Palatinate, was planned and carried out from considerations of raison d'etat. Its reasons were coldly logical, kind of reptilian logic, but logic nonetheless. Trying to find a way to, there we go, find a way to end this recording.